Are you looking for all the answers about how to have a perfect marriage, how to be a perfect parent, and how to have the life that you always dreamed of? Well, then this probably isn't the podcast for you. I'm Angela, a mom of 8, and I convinced my husband to join me and co-host this podcast. We are going to talk about all things related to parenting, marriage, faith, and finances, and just have some real, raw, unfiltered conversations about all of those things. So grab your coffee, pop your earbuds in, and let's go. Pete, but I meant to put on deodorant.
Is that what that is?
That is not me. Well, it actually might be me. I rarely smell, but I definitely do.
You have like a very nice sweater on right now.
And
pajama pants.
And slippers. I look like a bridge troll. Okay. Hello, friends. Welcome back. Today we are going to be just having a little conversation about, I mean, what would you call this? Like, you know, we kind of just want to talk about the differences between free range parenting, helicopter parenting, and really sort of the realities of the risks that our kids face. How worried should we be? And what do those parenting tactics look like when they're played out through adolescence and into adulthood, right?
I think there's a lot of myths out there right now that steer a lot of
fear.
Fear, how people parent.
Yeah.
We've experienced kind of all of that and share with you how we navigate the terrain, if you will.
Yeah. Well, public perception doesn't often match reality in many, many things, but parenting and child safety is definitely an area where perception doesn't match reality. And I'm guilty. I mean, I will sit here and tell you that I'm absolutely guilty. And I've had to, the part of the reason I wanted to talk about this was because I had to really come to a place where I knew what my instincts told me as far as like how I wanted to raise my kids, but it didn't match what my anxiety was telling me were the dangers that my kids were in. So there are real dangers. There are real things, but there are also things that we sort of create in our mind.
That's right.
So
I think your steady diet of true crime podcasts might contribute just a little bit.
Do you think that contributes to the fact that you have to come get me from work every night? If you if you guys don't know, we have a freestanding building in our backyard that was once just like a storage shed, and now it's become a home office, podcast studio, whatever, filming place. It's, what is it, like 24 by 12?
Yeah.
So it's my office, but you use it too. So anyways, it's our office.
I have to knock, so technically it's yours.
Not always welcome, But all of that to say, when I work at night, which is frequently these days that I'm out here until after dark, and I will text CR and say, can you come get me from work? And I make him walk across the backyard to walk me back inside. Our yard is fenced. We live in a neighborhood. It's not,
Right.
it's not, I'm not
and
afraid of wild animals.
We have floodlights galore. We're like a Walmart parking lot. It's
but
very
the
well lit.
lights are always like out and stuff. If I could see all through the yard, I wouldn't do that, but I can't. I can't see past like 5 feet in front of my face. So I make you come get me.
You're like a bat. Let's go back in time a little bit.
Okay.
All right. When you were growing up, I have a question for you. So when you were growing up, first and foremost, at what age would you say your mom and dad let you kind of play unsupervised outside of the house?
Oh, I don't even remember. Young enough that I don't remember. Listen, I want to say something really quickly. I love my mom and dad. Mom and dad, if you're listening, I love you. You are great parents. Nothing I say in this episode is a indictment on your parenting at all. Back into the episode.
And now back. Thank you for that disclaimer.
I mean, yeah, and my sister's 13 months older than I am, and it was just the two of us for most of our childhood. We didn't have another sibling until we were 13, 14. I don't remember, definitely like maybe 6 or 7. I remember being outside and playing with neighbor kids. But my parents also, I don't know how to say this, like they put the fear of God in us about strangers. And about talking to strangers and about safety. Ashley and I were terrified children when it came to interactions with people. So yeah, we played outside in the front yard and we would, hang out with like neighborhood friends and kids and stuff, but we weren't like riding all over the place and I mean, I guess what I'm saying is if anybody would have even like tried to speak to me, I would have screamed and ran. So I was a very hyper vigilant child.
Okay.
But I did have a lot of freedom, comparatively speaking. What
Okay.
about you?
So about the same age. I mean, I was born in 1984, so I think technically we're millennials,
Wow.
but we're kind
what
of
do you
in
mean we? You're like 10 years older than me.
Liar.
I just turned 25.
Liar. So I vividly remember playing baseball or hockey or football with friends hacky sack with friends in the neighborhood at, I mean, yeah, about 6, I would say. I mean, that's when I started like t-ball and started making friends at school. The reason I ask this is because there's a lot of study that's done around unsupervised play based on generations. I think the marker in the sand is around like 1982 that says if you're born 82 or before, the age range at which your parents let you play unsupervised was like ages 6 to 8. So that kind of first grade, second grade time frame. Whereas if you fast forward to, I guess, what's the generation after
I don't
millennials?
even know. I can't keep track of
Gen
all of
Z,
these.
maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
So 1995 or later, that skyrockets to like 11 and 12 years old.
Yeah.
So there's a huge difference there.
Well, let me ask you.
Okay.
Did you ever have anything happen in your childhood that
Scary
scared
story.
you?
I do have
or
one.
that you felt like you were in danger, or that you actually were in danger?
I would say yes. There's one story that jumps to mind. It's funny because Kennedy asked me the same question the other day coming back from horseback riding. She goes, "Dad, what's the scariest thing that ever happened to you?" And I had to think about it for a second, but I have a very vivid memory. I grew up in Southern California. We were trick-or-treating with, I don't know, there's probably about 7 or 8 of my friends.
How old were you?
I was about 10.
Okay.
I was about 10. And we were trick-or-treating. It was dark out. I remember it was pretty dark. So I would say 7, 8, 9 o'clock maybe, which is probably pretty late. You know, I wouldn't let our kids out at 9 o'clock by themselves to trick-or-treat today. So we can talk more about that.
You were also an only child too. I feel like you should mention that.
True.
as well.
Only child. We were trick-or-treating and we were near our elementary school where we used to go to school. And out of nowhere, we see kind of about 60, 70 yards away up the street, we see 2 cars side by side facing in opposite directions, but in the road, and a bunch of hooting and hollering and kind of guys yelling at each other.
I doubt they would say that they were hooting and
hollering. And so next thing you know, we hear like tires screeching and we see a bunch of smoke, and then we hear gunshots. And so it was like I don't want to say it was a drive-by shooting.
It was a shooting.
It was a run by fruiting. Little Mrs.
They were
Doubtfire
shooting
fun.
at each other.
Yeah, one car ended up shooting at another car. I don't know how many shots were fired. All I know is like all of my friends and I
hit the ground.
We dove in like down this little like into this little ditch near our elementary school and just kind of stayed there for a few minutes until it was quiet again. Then we all ran home. It was a scary situation, but it was also like legitimate, right? It wasn't manufactured fear. It was like, we could have gotten a stray bullet in the back of the
in the hip.
Anyways,
in the buttocks, like
I'll never forget it. I mean, obviously it's a little fuzzy, but I remember it happening. And
I think that the only thing that I can think of, and okay, well, I could actually think of many, because like I said, I was a very skittish child. I thought that everybody was going to try to hurt me. And so I would hide, like my parents would leave us in the car, right? Because it wasn't illegal then. And parents didn't think anything of it. They would go into the grocery store to just grab a few things, and they'd leave Ash and I in the car. And we would crawl under the seat in front of us. Like we would crawl down into the floorboard and hide in the floorboard because we were both so afraid. Now, listen, I think it should also be said. So you grew up in Southern California. I grew up in a lot of different places, but a lot of these memories that I have are from when we lived in Florida.
Okay.
And I tried to do a little research to get actual statistics, but I had a hard time finding them. But as I remember, there was a high amount of child kidnappings in Florida at the time when we were growing up. Perhaps late 80s, early 90s.
We can talk
and
about
this is also like the time of Adam Walsh, right? I mean, my goodness. Put the fear of God into every parent across America.
Milk carton.
That was the time in which I was a small child in Florida, was during this time when this man and his story was so well known. Parents were afraid. my parents, if I remember correctly, there was even a time period where Ash and I slept in my parents' room because my parents were afraid that we might get taken out of our own bedroom. I might be misremembering that, but I just know that my parents had so many conversations with us about strangers and kidnappings and safety and stuff. So what it inadvertently created was a lot of anxiety in me as a kid and a hypervigilance, which is good. It's good to be vigilant, but when you're hypervigilant, it can cloud your actual intuition, your actual like fear sensors, can become clouded if the hypervigilance is just like everything becomes an issue, everything raises your heart rate. But I remember when I was in the 6th grade, I think, when this happened, and Ash was sick and she wasn't going to school that day. We were on and off homeschooled, but this was a year that we were in public school, and Ash wasn't going to go to school that day. And so the bus stop was at the end of the block. So maybe like 5 house distances away from our house. And it was kind of a rainy morning. This was when we lived in Oregon. So this is where, you and I met a couple years later. But I walked to the bus stop and there were no other kids there. There was only like 3 or 4 kids at the bus stop anyways, but nobody else was going to school that day. And I was like, what the heck is going on? So my alerts were up, right? My, what is that? My spidey senses, my spidey senses were real up. And so I'm standing at the bus stop and there's no other kids. And so I'm a little bit nervous at this point. And this little red car pulls up right in front of me and slows down. And as he slows down, he leans over and looks out the window at me, and it's an older man. And he's just kind of looks at me and then turns right on the street right there, which led into a cul-de-sac. And so I freaked out. My brain said, that man is going to kidnap me. He's turning around in the cul-de-sac to come back and get me. So I started screaming. There was a house right there. I ran. She didn't have a fence up, but it was like her house, the back of her house was up against, facing the road. Okay. So I run down into her yard, and knowing that if this man does pull over, he just has to open the door and walk over and get me, right? Like so I'm beating on her back door, screaming, help me. And this lady comes to the door in her pajamas, this little old, probably not old, maybe like in her 60s. And she's like, honey, what's wrong? And I'm like crying and tell her that I think this man's trying to kidnap me. So then she's asking me, like, what does he look like? What does he drive? What does he whatever? And as I'm describing him in the car, she's like, well, where did he go? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't seen him. I don't know where he went. She basically informs me that the description I gave her of the man and the car fits the description of her neighbor who lived in that cul-de-sac. So at that point, I felt really embarrassed because I'm like, I don't know if this man was actually like gonna do something or if he was just being weird. Yeah, no. Or if I was, Like,
why slow down and like lean over and stare at you?
Yeah, but I was still like totally humiliated because that man like lived in that house, and I just felt like I don't know. I was really embarrassed, but so I ended up just getting on the school bus and going to school. Okay. But I was shaken the whole rest of the day, and I still think about that all the time because I think like, was my intuition right? Was he potentially not a good person that was going to do something bad? So that was the only thing. Like, so I certainly wasn't being shot at, but I have little instances like that throughout my childhood that I remember that,
No, that's creepy.
That scared me and made me very aware.
So we were talking about that story in South Carolina the other day where it was, a little girl was abducted, and it was somebody, a neighbor, 6 houses or whatever up the road, within 100 yards?
It was 150. Yeah, it was 150 feet, I think, from her house is what they said. I mean, he was just a couple houses away. And unfortunately, that little girl did pass away. Yeah. They found her body in his backyard area.
Tragedy. And so you hear stories like that, and then you think of the story that you just told. Yeah. And it's like your response, it's justified. It's a justified response. Fear, and I would rather our children err on the side of caution in situations like that than not. You know what I mean? It turned out to be okay, but
listen, if I've learned one thing from reading that book that I was telling you about, which maybe we could talk about that in a whole other episode, but this book called The Gift of Fear, and talking a lot about intuition, is that I know for a fact that I had an intuitive response to that situation. It was a like visceral fear reaction. And it wasn't, I don't know, it didn't feel manufactured to me at all. It felt like a fear response where my body ran away with me and said, like, this is what you have to do, like, do this. And I did it, you know? So I don't know. But I think that brings up an excellent question. As we bring up the little girl in South Carolina, we hear stories like that, and it does cause us as parents to go, oh my gosh, I can trust no one. But I think that the way that we mitigate any kind of fear related to that is to educate ourselves with information and understand what the real risks are. In the age of media being what it is, social media, news, and all of that, it's great. There's so many positive things about it, but part of it is it's made our world really small. And so we know about things that we would otherwise never know about. And so it puts our hackles up about stuff that we might otherwise not have our hackles up about. So what are truly, what are the statistics? What are the odds of your child being kidnapped by somebody? I think that's one thing. If you ask a parent, what, on average, like, what do you know? What are the odds of your child being kidnapped?
No, I know that during the 80s and 90s, we were at like a crime spike. General crime rates, however you want to do it. I mean, when you look at crime, there's bad guys or girls doing bad things, right? So it kind of peaked, I guess, in the 80s or 90s, and we've been on a downward trajectory ever since then.
First of all, most kidnappings, the vast majority, are going to happen by a family member, as in the child's mother, father, biological parent, those types of situations.
Like a domestic dispute thing and over custody. Okay.
And then the next highest category is by an acquaintance. So it's somebody that, your child has a awareness of already. But it's something like 1 in 1.5 million are the chances that your child will be kidnapped by a stranger and disappear.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Would you say we're safer today than we were than when we grew up?
Well, I know that we are. And I know that because I've done the research. So it doesn't, here's what I will say. It doesn't feel like it. There's so many days and so many instances that it doesn't feel like it. But statistically, we're so much safer. Everything from playground equipment to
I'm so glad you brought that up.
To road hazards and I mean, I think that sometimes parents, like, we have this vision, like everyone else is going to hurt our child, but statistically speaking, children are most often hurt by their own parents. They're murdered by their own parents, abused by their own parents. They're 40 times more likely to die as a passenger in a car than they are to be kidnapped or killed by a complete stranger. 40 times more likely. And so when people are like, oh, here come those, and I don't mean to use this term in a flippant way, but it's what it's often referred to online. They will refer to certain moms as, the car seat Nazis. And I don't use that term flippantly. It's what, is often said online. And it's harsh because it's like, if there's going to be one area that you should be hyper vigilant about because there's a real risk to your kid, it's the way their car seat is installed and the way they are buckled into their car seat. And it's terrifying to see how often that goes. I mean, that's a tangent. That's kind of one of those things that I'm like, if you really want to have something to be super frightful of, it's being safe in a vehicle.
Yeah,
it's being safely, and parents not using their phones in the car and the distraction of driving and all of that. Like, that's where our kids are at the most risk, truthfully.
I want to go back to the playground equipment thing real quick.
Okay.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's something that is noticeably different. I think when I was growing up, recess out on the playground, everything was made out of iron and steel, and I just remember black concrete and.
Well, I had like the worst injury ever from that, like spidery octopus thing.
Oh yeah, I remember
Do you
you telling
remember
me
me talking about that? That
Ugh.
I slid. It was wet. I was wearing jelly sandals. This was in Oregon, and I slipped. And that bar, I always say like I crotched the bar. I don't know what other term there is, but I got a huge bruise on the
Right.
inside of my leg and like upper thigh area. It was so painful.
Mm-hmm.
It was so painful.
And now, like, you look at playground. Well, that's painful. I'm sorry
It
you had to go through
recovered.
that.
The Queen Mother recovered. She's all right.
And so you look at playground equipment today, and it's almost injury proof to a certain extent.
Oh yeah, it's like
it's
rubber pellets at the
hard
bottom.
for kids to get hurt on it. And I noticed this, and it's like I don't know where I land with it, right? Because we want our children to not get hurt. Obviously, that is a net good, but at what cost, right? There's a point where you reach, I don't know if the law of diminishing return. I don't even know if that's the right terminology. That's an economic term, but how much safety are we going to shoot for before you sacrifice the ability to handle risk with your kid? Like a kid growing up hasn't interacted with any type of risk where they can potentially get hurt, not die, but just get hurt, learn from the scenario, and grow as a result. Instead, we're thrusting them into these environments where they're in bubbles all the time. They're being supervised all the time. They don't know how to make rules for games, how to be flexible with rules, what happens when they don't get their way. And all of this comes at a cost, right? And I think this is a reflection of what you and I were talking about a little while ago, where, growing up, I think our parents probably erred on the side of, there were some risky situations, probably shouldn't have done that. Whereas fast forward to today, we're not letting our kids be risky enough, and we're seeing it manifest itself in different ways on college campuses, in schools, in how we feed kids, in how they're medicated, what jobs they're getting. I heard a story the other day about a kid who was fresh out of college, applied for his first job, didn't get it, and the mom called in and was like basically complaining and inquiring why her son. No, it was on a YouTube channel I watched. I can't remember where I heard it. It's like, how does that happen? You know what I
mean? And researchers they've been looking into this because, this whole idea of helicopter parenting, I think sometimes what people don't realize is they hear that term and they think, well, that's not me. And we don't want to identify that way. But the idea of sort of being this omnipresent parent is very, very real. And what our kids today, because of the structure of their lives, they spend their entire lives being told what to do and how to do it and when to do it, and in complete bubble of protection by teachers, by parents. Then they're in structured activities. They have some kind of authority figure constantly giving them the instructions, the directions on how to do everything, and mitigating all the risks for them. And without risks, you can't build confidence. You literally have to have it in order to build confidence, and not just confidence, but even creativity in children. Despite the fact that certain like test scores like SATs and things like that are, on an upward trend in certain areas, what we're sacrificing is this idea of creativity. So they're capable of smart thinking, of thinking of things in an intelligent way. However, the lane in which they can do that is very, very narrow. They can only do it for certain subjects, the ones in which they've been taught in school how to think and how to answer the test questions, basically. Basically what researchers are kind of finding is that kids really need this opportunity. They're outsourcing all of their thinking to someone else. We're not letting them take the reins of that thinking. And it's almost like, biologically speaking, kids need to go through the scientific process even in play, right? This idea that they're going to hypothesize something, then they're going to go through the trial of trying it, this like experiment with a decision. What happens if I do this? Then after they see what happens, they analyze that data in their minds. Okay, this happened when I did this. When I took that risk, I fell off my bike and scraped my knee. Didn't like that, but I know how I can change something and do something different next time or whatever. Like they need that opportunity to explore those things for themselves, be able to think for themselves and be able to make decisions about what risks are worth it and what aren't.
No, you have to learn how to interact with risk, how to engage with it, how to learn from it in order to have a hope of becoming a self-governing adult at some point. Otherwise, you go back to exactly what you were talking about, where you're looking to others to steer you in the right direction, course correct, fix things for you, right? And that's not healthy. That's unhappy. It's unhealthy and it's unhappy in my opinion. And so how do we get there? What can
it's also
we do?
breeding. I do want to add, it's also breeding a lot of anxiety in our children.
Ooh, good point. That's a whole other side of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's this inability to allow them to build a natural resilience to situations, a natural resilience to saying, sort of like I said, this happened to me and I didn't die. I fell out of a tree and I broke my arm and it hurt like hell.
How did you learn to climb a tree?
But I didn't die.
Did you just start climbing, or is it, Angie, I want you to go ahead and put your foot here. Don't go past this branch.
Right.
You see my point?
Yeah,
It's
I
like
totally see what you're saying. And it's very much like that. Like kids, in order to learn to deal with their own anxiety and worry about things, you have to give their brain an opportunity to determine, because what do our brains do, right? They come up with the worst possible what could happen, right? And they need to learn how to walk back from that and also go through the motions of seeing like, okay, I got hurt and it wasn't that. I kind of think of like when I started riding horses, I was 19, I wasn't a kid, and I was so afraid of coming off a horse. I was so afraid of getting dumped, of coming off a horse, because all I could think was like, I'm going to get really, really hurt. This is going to hurt really bad. I've been dumped a couple of times. Once was in an arena full of a bunch of people, and
actually once was kind of bad, I remember.
But I didn't get hurt though.
Yeah.
I got the wind knocked out of me. But if you remember,
you felt like on your pistols or something, didn't you?
Yeah, we should clarify that if
That's
you're
right.
going to use the word pistols. So I used to do this thing called cowboy mounted shooting. You shoot at balloons with powder. It's like a blank, and you have these two, 45 pistols that are like, 6 shooters.
They're
basically.
blanks, yeah. You shoot balloons. It was awesome to watch. It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. It's a sport. It was fun. But all of that to say, I came off that horse. I landed on my back. She popped up and dumped me backwards, but I, got the wind knocked out of me, but I got upset and like, oh, you will not humiliate me like that in front of all these people, and I jumped back on and kept going. But my point is that it took a few times, of me coming off to realize it didn't feel good. It didn't tickle, but it didn't kill me either. Do you know what I mean? Like it didn't.
And oh, dude, you nailed it right there. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That's the current mindset that I see society operating in. Huh. Whereas we need to get back
Instead
to
of what doesn't kill you
makes you stronger, right? Because you're talking about a term that I want you to Google this after we get off the podcast. That you may not have run into it, but it's called anti-fragility, anti-fragile, right? There's two very, very good examples that we can point to of things that are anti-fragile. One is our bones.
Right.
With our kids, we watched a documentary on, what's his name? Is it Scott Anderson, who's the guy that has been in space for like a year?
Yes.
Is that his name?
I can't remember if that's his name or not.
Me neither. But he's an American astronaut who spent like, I don't know.
It was a year.
Almost a full year up in space. And they were walking through this documentary about some of the things he does while he's up there. And one of the very first things he talks about is how important exercise is. And he dove into the details of the skeletal system and how if your bones aren't being used, they become more brittle.
Okay.
Right? Our bones are made to be used and become more durable the more you use them. They are anti-fragile. All right? Whereas like a plastic cup, for instance, like we give our kids sippy cups. Those are intended not to be broken. All right? But they don't get stronger when you throw them and they hit the ground.
So what he's saying is when you break your bone, it becomes stronger?
When you use them, not fully broken. When you use them, they actually build in endurance is the wrong word. They become more dense. I don't know. I feel like I need to
Yeah, that's
dive into the
interesting.
science a little bit. But another good example would be your immune system.
Right.
All right, and this is where I was going with it. Was another great example is it becomes stronger as it gets exposed to things it's not supposed to.
Correct.
All right, so
It builds
why
up those
can't
immunities.
we parent that way? We know it's in the natural law somewhere. It's in biology, right? Our bodies are built to be anti-fragile to a certain extent, but we are in the society right now that is so risk avert that we're not flexing that muscle. We're not raising anti-fragile kids by not exposing them to risk.
What's interesting is there's another facet of all of this type of parenting, this omnipresent parenting,
Really?
that it has an effect that I don't think that people are always aware of, the consequences. Part of that is there's an argument to be made that part of the reason people have less children now than they used to and are unhappier with children, and children are unhappier, is because of this omnipresent parenting is freaking exhausting. And parents of generations before had more children and were less tired and irritated and happier with their children and their lives because of the type of parenting. And again, I know there's a lot of arguments to be made for, different methods of parenting and things like that. But I do find it interesting that you and I often get asked, I don't know how you guys handle it with all of these kids. And I don't know how you, and to a degree, I understand that, but there's definitely a level of it that I think sometimes has to do with the fact that you and I are not helicopter parents for the most part. We're not omnipresent parents. We allow our children a great deal of freedom when it comes to playing, at least what would be viewed as a great deal of freedom in today's society. And it affords us an opportunity to, it's not like we're hands-on parenting, controlling every aspect of 8 different children's lives 24/7.
Well, there's certainly a difference, right? With the twins, with Benji, like they're all of age where we need to be there.
There's also something to understand here as well. Like we also know that there's a little bit of a different spin when you have a child with special needs or a child with
That's a good point.
different intellectual capabilities. You have to know your kids, and that's an important part here. We're not saying, our daughter's 8 years old and she has Down syndrome. We don't send
you've
her.
hit the age. See ya.
We don't say like, you're 8 now, go ahead and hop on your bike and ride around the neighborhood.
That's right.
We don't do that. But we are a lot more free range parenting than the average person when it comes to certain things. Somebody asked me the other day, like, well, I'm in this Facebook group that is a mom Facebook group, and they're really nationwide, but there's local chapters as well, and there's conversations in there all the time about, do you allow your children to play in the backyard unsupervised, like fenced in backyard? And there are moms for which they will tell you absolutely no. If they're outside, I am with them. If they're in the backyard, I'm with them. And I can imagine where that would get exhausting.
Yeah.
How would you possibly?
No, that's hard. It's hard because it's like, man, you just want to hug those people and be like,
it's okay.
They're going to be okay. Now, there's some things that
there's nuances here, and we need to be careful because we don't want to piss people off.
There's definitely nuance. I look at like our son, okay, has almost close to zero self-preservation skills, right? That's just the reality. The kid is all over the place all the time. I mean, I looked out our back window the other day. He was climbing on top of the playhouse, right? And probably 20 feet up, he could fall down and definitely get hurt and break an arm, break a leg. But I thought about it. I'm like, you know what? If he does, he's going to learn from it. I don't want him to get hurt. I do not want him to get. I want to reiterate that. I'm not setting up situations for him to fail. But I also want him to learn on his own that climbing up high on something that potentially is unstable, that's risky. And that risk might result in breaking an arm. Is it going to be the end of the world? No. But I'm also talking to myself thinking, okay, well, what if he falls off and breaks his neck? You know what I
Right.
mean? Or he breaks his back. Like there's certain elements where head, eyes, spine, neck, like those are areas where you don't want to take any risk, right? The
Right.
return on whatever event you're participating in isn't big enough to sacrifice those elements. But
There's certain areas of your body that you need to protect at all costs.
exactly. And that was a scenario where I thought through it a little bit more and was like, you know what? Yeah, I want him to get down from there because he doesn't have that element where he recognizes how much risk is at stake or what's at stake. And, you know, I hollered at him, say, hey man, don't climb off the roof of the playhouse before you fall down and get hurt.
Well, and they love to climb that tree. We have this big tree in our
my gosh,
backyard.
yes.
But what did they do? Do you remember what they did the first time that they started climbing that tree?
They got stuck.
No. What did they wear? What did they go put on?
I don't remember.
They wear their bike helmets.
Oh, that's right.
And the life vests.
That's right.
the what are those called? I don't remember. They
a
have
life vest.
Yeah, it's a life vest, but it's like super thick and padded.
Yeah.
And they wear those when they climb the tree. And I remember the first time I saw them up there, I was like, oh, I have to get them down for the very same reason, right? Thinking you could break your neck if you fall out of that tree. But then I was like, well, he's got a helmet on and he's wearing a very thick padded body vest. And I'm just going to, you know, trust me, as a mom, I'm constantly saying where, you know, oh, this feels like it's a line and which side of this line do I want to be on?
Yeah.
Now, as far as like how we parent and raise our kids and what we think, what we've done with all this information, right? Like what we've learned and, you know, how we've kind of figured this out and how we apply it to our own family and our own lives. I feel like it should be said that one of my biggest areas of protection when it comes to my children is of sexual abuse. I'm very, very, very aware that that is something that I will be hyper vigilant to protect my children from as best as I can. So for me, that's where I feel like those risks are harder for kids to know how to take and when to take when it comes to interacting with adults and other people. And so, for example, you know, CR knows our kids play with other kids in the neighborhood all the time. They go over and they play, but we have a rule. You cannot go inside anyone's house. That's just our rule, and our kids know it. There's no bending, there's no flexing. You can't go inside other people's houses.
And if we're being honest, like this is something that you had to walk me through.
Yes,
like
because
this
you
is
didn't
something
understand.
that we just kind of initially disagreed on. And even to this day, like I have a tendency to want to push the envelope because I don't know, I'm not a dirtbag. I could never see myself or anybody I
Right.
interact with doing that to a child.
But that's how everybody feels
Right.
and then they meet this person, this neighbor, this person that they find out is a child molester, and they're like, oh my gosh, I never would have guessed that.
Yeah.
And my thing is that's the kind of thing that, number one, is obviously can be very scarring for children for the rest of their lives. And there's a price to pay for trauma. And so for me, the idea that you might break a bone and that's really going to stink and it's going to hurt and all of that is a far cry from the idea that you might forever be mentally scarred and damaged by this act that happened to you. And I am just the type of person that feels like you don't always know these people. And even the people that you think you do know can turn out to be something totally different. And for me, there's just not a good enough reason. And I think this is where a lot of parents come to when they look at, okay, the risk they're going to let their kids take and not take, right? When we're weighing this out. For everything you protect them from, there's a price to pay for it. And is the price appropriate? Are you willing to pay it? And vice versa. For everything you don't protect them from, there can be a potential price to pay. And for me, climbing a tree and maybe falling and breaking your arm is a risk that I'm willing to let them take. Going into a neighbor's house and risking that their dad, mom, grandma, grandpa, whoever is there might sexually assault you, start grooming you, is not a risk I'm willing to take. It's not one that's worth you being able to play inside of this person's house that I don't really know that well. I met your parents a few times. They seem like nice people, whatever the situation is. It doesn't matter. It's just a no-go for me.
Now, how have we navigated this too? Because yes, like that's our rule, but obviously our kids play with neighborhood kids. We know the other neighbors. How have we established that?
We're just very honest. And we don't say, listen, our kid can't come to your house because we're afraid you might be a child molester. that feels like an unneighborly thing to do. We just say, this is across the board our rule. It's nothing personal. It's just our family's rule. And most parents are okay with respecting that. I feel like anyways, what we've encountered is that just by saying, listen, it's nothing personal. It's just our family rule. Your kids are welcome to come play over in our backyard or whatever, but we just don't allow our kids in other people's homes. And everyone's been okay with that. We haven't had no pushback at all.
No, it's hard. The hardest part is the kids
They don't
themselves.
understand.
Yeah, because we don't get into that with them. We don't explain. We're not trying to promulgate fear in our children, but we just say the rule is we don't do this. And so they continuously ask, right? It's just something that you draw the line and say, nope, sorry, you guys are welcome to play in the backyard, front yard, ride your bikes, whatever. But that's the rule.
Yeah.
And so,
it's interesting because in some areas we allow our children more freedom than the average bear, and in others we don't. And so we are constantly in that, battle with our kids. Like, yep, our boys ride their bikes around the neighborhood, which other parents might not let their kids do. And that's one that I've had a hard time with, that you and I have had to go back and forth on, with Jonah being 6 years old and riding bikes with his brother and the other boys in the neighborhood. That's been a hard one for me. But there's other areas in which, like none of our children have cell phones, and we don't go there,
Another podcast.
That's another podcast.
Yeah.
Yes. Because if you want to talk about the risks, the real risks to kids, and,
Let's talk some social media.
Well, and I
from
feel
two
like
people who make a living in social media.
But I feel like, oftentimes, especially we live in North Carolina, and North Carolina is in the top 10 states for trafficking, for human trafficking. And when you hear things like that, it can be easy to think that your child is at risk of being snatched up off the sidewalk by somebody who wants to sell them into sex trafficking. But the reality, again, you've got to dig below the surface of your initial emotions and response to something in order to really understand it. Because what I didn't want for my kids was for them to grow up with the same kind of fear and anxiety that I have, that at 35 years old, I'm still trying to navigate how to let it go and live my life and be less anxious. And I'm getting better, but it's taken me a really long time. And I don't want that same thing for my kids. So I'm trying to protect them from what I can, but to be realistic about what are the actual dangers and, things like that.
There's a good saying that's out there. I don't know who said it, but I remember hearing it. Do your best to prepare the child for the road and not the road for the child.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
I think that's a good way to look at parenting in 2020. And I think that adage was something that if you hang on to and really kind of get behind it a little bit when you're assessing certain scenarios, what are the costs, to your point? What are some of the risk factors that are at stake? And pull the trigger. Don't be afraid of what other people think. Don't be
the judgment of the mom shamers.
Yeah, give yourself a little bit of grace and allow your children to get hurt every now and again. It happens.
You've got to expose them to a healthy amount of risk, help them learn how to manage it, teach them the management skills, to manage it in a mature way, and what controlled risk looks like. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between just like risk for risk's sake and controlled risk, but really teaching them through living life and letting them live life alongside you and experience things with you and learn. You could really get into the weeds here of cooking and using knives and using the oven and using the stove and the microwave, and really like sort of bringing them alongside you as like a sous chef, like really exposing them where you are there to guide them as they're learning.
Why you hold the knife this way? What's the risk of cutting a potato or a carrot this way? Well, I hold my finger back because I don't want to cut it off. It can happen. Right. Do your best to resist the tendency to ban everything everywhere at all times. And what I mean by that is, had Noah fallen off of the treehouse, right, the other day when he was climbing up there, had he fallen down and my immediate response was to go out there and rip the whole thing down because it's dangerous for all kids, that's a bad thing. That's a net bad. we have a tendency to want to ban everything everywhere all the time if somebody gets hurt. And we have to do our best to avoid the tendency to ban everything everywhere all the time if somebody gets hurt.
Right.
When the stakes aren't really that high.
Yeah, there needs to be an opportunity for kids to learn how to work it out.
That's right.
And also, I think, too, an element of teaching them about their intuition, teaching them to listen to their intuition, teaching them what does that look like. And, I think there's a happy middle ground between, like I said, I love you, Mom and Dad, so much, but teaching our kids that there are good people, and most adults are good people who don't want to hurt you, but there are bad ones. And here's signs that are bad signs. Adults shouldn't be asking you for help. Adults don't need a child's help.
It's a good call.
Adults
Never thought about
don't. Do you
that.
know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like there's certain things that can be signals to children that predators will often use to garner a child's trust. And that's what I'm talking about with like the grooming and stuff, where for me, I'm not going to put you in a situation to be groomed by these predators, because they're smart and they use all of these different, preset out techniques in order to groom children. So teaching children sort of what those techniques might look like and how to avoid them, but listening to their intuition, because you don't want to raise children that are just completely afraid of everybody all the time. But also understanding that, one of the greatest reasons that children keep secrets when something does happen to them is because of the threat that is made by the perpetrator, right? Telling a child that nobody will believe you, your parents won't believe you, they won't love you anymore, they won't like you, that you're a bad person, I'll hurt your family. Making sure that your kids know that without question, and I think this, again, we could make a whole nother episode about stuff like this, but this all comes back to your relationship with your kids when you're parenting them in normal circumstances, teaching them that they can come to you when they've made a mistake and what that looks like. Yeah. That it's, I love that meme, I've shared it, and it's a little trite, but I think it's true, is that you want, when your kids do something wrong, when something bad happens, they've made a bad choice, you don't want them to say, oh, crap, I can't let my dad find out. You want them to say, oh, I need to talk to my dad. And so making sure that they have that relationship with you as a parent, so that they don't buy into that lie
that's a good one.
That, if your parents find out, you're going to be in trouble and whatever. And they know that that's not true. They know that they can talk to you. And again, that's a whole can of worms and potentially a whole other episode. And all of this looks very different, depending on where you live and what the child's circumstances are. But just for us as parents, this is how we've kind of worked it out. Yeah. And like you said, we still have issues that we kind of have to spar on a little bit.
We're flexible. That's the key. I mean, you don't need to be so rigid in a parenting style that once new information presents itself,
you're unable.
Right, you're unable to implement something new that might work. You're unable to
be flexible and change. And that's where I had to come to too, like with the bike riding, and a lot of that has come from you, because I didn't grow up a boy. I didn't have any brothers growing up. So boy behavior is not always going to look different or the same, if that makes sense. But it often, little boys tend to play a little differently than little girls. They're more
risks. They seek risk out more.
Yeah. And so I didn't grow up with that. So I often am like, what are these fools doing? Like, what are these cats doing? And I will say to my dad, like, did you do this as a kid? Or I'll ask you, did you do this as a kid? And you were a pretty tame kid. So there's even times that you've said, I don't know, like, no, I didn't do that. But again, you grew up as an only child, and there's then you've got to add in this like herd mentality of multiple children that can sort of drag each other into making poor choices together and stuff. So there's a lot there's a lot there that we've had to sort of navigate together and have these conversations and say, okay, our kid did this, and I am like floored by it and don't know how to handle it. Is this normal? I mean, we have that conversation all the time, but with the bike riding specifically, you had to sort of educate me, because I felt like it didn't feel like a good idea. But the more that we talked through what the circumstances were, what the parameters were around it, we got to a place where we felt comfortable with what that would look like for our family and our neighborhood at that age for that child. Bingo. And I think that's the biggest thing is with 8 children, I will tell you that the rules parameters look different for different kids. And we don't have that. Everything has to be fair and the same. We just don't.
Life
it
isn't.
can't.
Sorry.
Life isn't, and it can't be. And you also, as a child, the choices you make will tell us as parents what we can trust you with, what we can't, and where
how loose the leash can be in certain areas. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something we let our kids know. You've continued to make bad choices when given these opportunities, so now you won't have those opportunities for a while, whatever the case may be. So it's different. We don't have an across-the-board standard way that's the same for everybody, but I do think that we've loosened up a lot since we first had kids.
Well, let's be real. I mean, they're just wearing us out.
Well, yeah, we're also just tired.
Just
like,
joking.
well, whatever.
Let's bring this thing home. Is there anything that you've read, anything that you've watched that kind of touches on this topic that really jumps out that you would want to share?
Well, I do think that when I read one of the articles that I read said something that really kind of stuck with me, and that was that you would need to leave your kid outside alone for 750,000 years for them to be statistically likely to be abducted by a stranger.
Wow.
In order for that statistic to become likely, 750,000 years. And when you think about that, it changes the idea of like, okay, well, maybe it's not quite as scary as I've made it. So that, and then The Gift of Fear, I feel like that I kind of want to save that. I'll link it because it's a good book.
Or what?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's that book that I read, and but it was written 20 years ago. So a lot of the data that's in it is a little bit outdated.
Oh, this is the intuition one.
Yes.
Yeah,
And so, but I think it's an incredibly important read, and something that I want us to talk about in another episode as it relates to like adults, not kids, but like adults and intuition and fear and some crime and women and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I want us to dive into that later.
Cool.
But that was a good book and a good read for me. So what
Good
about
talk.
you?
Oh, for me, I think he's a professor at maybe New York University. This guy named Jonathan Haidt had a book come out a couple years ago. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind, and it kind of walks through some of the things we've talked about here around generationally, how we were raised as kids, how that is now influencing the way we raise our kids and how we interact with risk and danger and stuff like that. So link that one down, or maybe his some YouTube videos, who knows.
Okay.
It's a good one.
Yeah, we'll put all that in the comments. But well, this was a fun conversation-ish, fun-ish. It's never like fun to talk about your kids breaking their arms and getting kidnapped, but I think it's it's an important conversation because we just don't always know what to make of our feelings and anxieties and stuff. So we're certainly not perfect, and we don't always do everything right, but I feel like we've gotten a little bit wiser. 13 years into this parenting game, we've started to see things a little more clearly and been a little more able to make better decisions, really.
Yeah.
Or at least what feels better to us. Well, if y'all are enjoying this podcast, then be sure to head over and leave us a review. 5-star reviews are much appreciated. And you can also find us over on Instagram.
The podcast has its own Instagram page. It is _that escalated quickly. And then we also have our own personal Instagrams. Angie's is @thisgatherednest, and mine is @CR_Braniff.
I'll leave all that information in the show notes for y'all so that you can find us. And that is it for today's episode. I hope y'all have a fantastic day, and we will talk to y'all again soon.